The intake hall on Kareth Prime was built for bodies that weighed 600 pounds and stood 8 feet tall. The benches were slabs of molded alloy. The ceiling hung so high it collected its own weather, a faint mist that drifted between the light strips like something alive and bored. Everything on this station had been designed to make a Torvan feel comfortable, and everything else feel like a mistake. Meg Calder was 5'6", 130 pounds in her boots. She sat on the edge of a bench meant for 3 of her, and let her legs swing like a kid at a bus stop, because her feet didn't reach the floor. Her duffel sat between her knees. She didn't study the alien recruits filling the rows on either side of her. The Toravan with their armored hides and jaws that could snap rebar. The four-armed Alessi clicking tools between their fingers like nervous ticks made productive. The Keldari sitting in clusters with their translucent skin pulsing faint blues and greens as they communed silently with each other. She looked at the floor. She counted the bolts in the deck plate beneath her feet. 14. She counted them again. Still 14. Good. The world was holding. She was the 7th human to enter the Galactic Coalition's joint military program. The first 6 had washed out. 2 in the first week. 1 lasted a month before a training exercise broke 3 of her ribs, and her willingness to continue in the same fall. The other 3 made it further, but came home with the same look. The look of someone who had walked into a room where every living thing was bigger, faster, harder, and meaner, and discovered that courage doesn't actually close that gap. Meg knew this. She'd read their files. She'd read everything the Coalition had declassified about interspecies combat integration, and a fair amount they hadn't. She read the way some people drank, compulsively, late at night, looking for the thing at the bottom that would tell her she was wrong to be here. She hadn't found it yet. The processing officer was a Torvan named Drek Vassal. He stood behind a podium that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of dark stone, and held a data tablet that was comically small in his massive clawed hands. He worked through the intake roster with the enthusiasm of someone who had done this 900 times, and resented every single one. Calder, M. Terran origin. He paused, looked up, found her in the crowd. His eyes were gold and slitted, and they carried the particular expression of a predator who had just been told that something on the menu was also trying to sit at the table. Species file summary. He read it out loud, to the entire hall. No venom glands, no natural armor plating, no subdermal shielding, no sonic attack capability, no radiation tolerance beyond baseline, gravitational tolerance rated at 0.7 Coalition standard, bone density below minimum combat threshold, muscle density below minimum combat threshold, sensory range limited, regenerative capacity negligible. The hall reacted the way halls react. A low, rolling sound that started in the back rows where the Torvans sat, with their arms crossed over their massive chests, and spread forward through the Alessi sections, where it became a rapid clicking like rain on tin, and finally reached the Keldari, who didn't laugh out loud, but whose skin flushed a pale, rippling yellow that meant the same thing. Meg watched a pen on the processing officer's podium. Smooth surface, slight vibration from the station's engine core running through the deck. The pen was rolling, slowly, toward the edge. Drek Vassal finished reading her file. He looked at her again with those gold eyes that said everything his mouth was too professional to say. Assignment, he said. Fireteam 9th Fang. More laughter, louder this time. 9th Fang. Even Meg knew what that meant. She'd read about unit designations. The lower the number, the higher the prestige. 9th Fang was where the Coalition put the recruits it didn't want, but couldn't legally refuse. The broken ones, the political obligations, the warm bodies required by treaty to fill a roster no one expected to perform. The pen reached the edge of the podium. Meg caught it. One hand. Didn't look at it. Didn't look at Drek Vassal. Set it back on the podium's flat surface, and pushed it toward the center, with one finger. Drek Vassal stared at her hand for a moment longer than made sense. Then he moved to the next name. She found the Ninth Fang Barracks by following the signs that got progressively dirtier and more damaged the further she walked from the main concourse. The hallway lights flickered in one section. A cleaning drone sat dead against the wall. Its carapace cracked, and nobody had come to fix it. The barracks door had a dent in it, shaped like a fist, much larger than hers. Inside, 4 beings, and the particular silence of people who had stopped expecting anything good to walk through that door. Soren Cade, Torvan, squad leader, young for his species, which still made him look like a carved monument someone had dressed in combat fatigues. He sat on his bunk, cleaning a sidearm that was already clean. He'd been demoted twice. The details were classified, but the weight of them sat across his shoulders, like a yoke he hadn't figured out how to set down. Luca Bren, human, the only other one on the station, 28, paramedic from Detroit, before the Coalition Exchange pulled his number. He'd been on Karath Prime for 3 months, and had already learned the geometry of making yourself small. Where to sit so you weren't in anyone's sightline. How to speak at the volume that registered as non-threatening to Torvan hearing. When to laugh at jokes made at his species' expense, so that the joke stayed a joke, and didn't become something else. Nyx, Ilesi. 4 arms, all of them always doing something. She was rewiring a detonation trigger when Meg walked in. She'd been reassigned 4 times. Insubordination. She spoke in fragments. Whole sentences were for people who had earned her time. Tal Ven, Keldari, Navigator class. His species were psychic sensitive. They could read emotional fields, sense intention, feel the shape of another mind, the way a hand feels the shape of something in the dark. Tal Ven kept his sensitivity shut like a fist. His skin never pulsed. A Keldari that still was a Keldari that was hiding from something. Soren looked up when Meg entered. Looked her over. All 5'6" of her. Human, he said. Not a greeting. A classification. Meg, she said. She dropped her duffel on the empty bunk. Sat down. The mattress was too firm, and the frame was too wide, and the blanket smelled like engine coolant and something vaguely biological she chose not to investigate. First mission brief is in an hour, Soren said. Resource survey. Dead moon. No expected contact. Meg pulled out her datapad. The mission file was already loaded. She read it the way she read everything. All of it. Then the parts nobody else would bother with. The footnotes, the prior survey logs, the incident flags marked as resolved. 20 minutes in, she looked up. What happened to the survey team that went missing here last cycle? Soren's jaw tightened. A small movement on a face built for large ones. Equipment failure, he said. It's in the file. It's in the file as a classification, Meg said, not as an explanation. The room got a particular kind of quiet. The kind where 4 people who have learned not to expect anything all feel the same small flicker of something at the same time, and don't know what to call it yet. Stop reading old files, Soren said. Meg looked back at her datapad. The drop pod hit Varric 4's atmosphere like a fist through wet paper. And the next 40 seconds were the kind of experience that rearranged your internal organs and your relationship with the idea of safety at the same time. Luca talked the entire way down, not because he had anything to say, because his mouth was a release valve, and if it stopped moving, the pressure would go somewhere worse. He talked about the pod's heat shielding, and the acceptable range of re-entry G-forces, and the statistical survival rate of combat drops, which he cited at 97.6%, a number he repeated 3 times, like a prayer that only works if you say it enough. Nyx sat across from Meg, with all 4 hands working a detonation trigger she'd already rebuilt twice. The motion was mechanical, ritual. Her hands needed a job, or they'd find one on their own. Tal then had his eyes closed and his fists pressed against his thighs. His skin was the flat gray of a Keldari in lockdown mode. Every psychic receptor shut, every sensory channel walled off. Whatever he was keeping out, he'd been keeping it out for a long time. Soren sat rigid in the command seat and stared at the descent readout with the focus of a man who believed that if he watched the numbers closely enough, they wouldn't go wrong. Meg watched the pen clipped to Soren's chest plate. It trembled with the vibration of the pod. She counted the trembles per second, estimated the pod's structural resonance frequency, decided they were fine, went back to watching the pen. They landed hard. The pod's dampeners absorbed most of it, and their bones absorbed the rest. Varric 4 opened up outside the hatch like a photograph of nothing. Gray rock, gray dust, a sky the color of old dishwater, stretched over a horizon that curved too sharply, because the moon was too small to pretend it was a planet. 6 hours of surface operations. Geological sampling. Atmospheric readings. Soren ran the team by the manual. Every protocol followed in order. Every checkpoint logged on time. He was good at this, the mechanical execution of a plan someone else had written. He moved through the tasks the way a man walks a path he's been told is safe. Carefully, without looking at the edges. Meg did her assignments, collected samples, tagged survey points, and between every task, she looked at things that weren't on the assignment list. The dust near the cave entrance was wrong. Not scattered, not wind-patterned, displaced, pushed outward from a central point in a fan shape that said something heavy had moved through here and moved in only one direction, into the cave. The dust on the other side, the exit pattern, was undisturbed. Whatever went in hadn't come out. She mentioned it to Soren during the midday break. Dust displacement near Cave Sigma 7, unidirectional entry pattern. No exit disturbance. Soren checked the subsurface scanners, thermal imaging, motion detection, seismic activity logs. Everything read clean. Empty caves, dead rock. Scanners say it's clear, he said. Scanners say what they can see, Meg said. Soren looked at her the way he always looked at her, with the particular discomfort of someone whose authority is technically unchallenged, but practically incomplete. Trust the equipment, Calder. During her rest rotation, she walked the perimeter of the cave mouth alone. The rock face was dark volcanic basalt, porous and brittle at the surface, dense beneath. She ran her hand along the wall because her fingers had learned things in fire seasons that her eyes sometimes missed. 3 parallel grooves, deep, clean, cut into the basalt with something harder than the rock itself. She put her hand inside one of the grooves. Whatever made these marks had claws the length of her leg and the strength to drag them through stone like a finger through wet sand. She took a photograph, walked back to camp, said nothing. Night on Varric 4 came fast and stayed for 9 hours. The moon's rotation was merciless. One moment the thin sunlight was painting everything in shades of pewter, and the next the dark dropped like a curtain pulled by someone who didn't believe in gradual transitions. They set the perimeter sensors in a standard ring, 12 units, motion triggered, hardened casings rated for temperature extremes and minor impacts. At hour 2 of the dark cycle, the sensors tripped, then died. Not malfunction, not power failure. The diagnostic logs showed each unit going offline in sequence, a neat counterclockwise arc around the camp. Something had walked the perimeter and taken them apart. Like it was reading. Soren was on his feet with his weapon charged before the last sensor flatlined. Nyx had 3 demolition charges armed and distributed to positions she'd calculated in the time it took Luca to find his boots. Tal then stood at the edge of camp with his eyes still closed, but his hands open now, palms out, shaking. "Ven," Soren said. "Report." Tal Ven's mouth moved, but the words came out strange, thin, like they were being squeezed through a space that was too small. "Something in the caves. It's not language. It's not thought. It's—" He doubled over, pressed both hands to his skull. His skin erupted in colors Meg had never seen on a Kaldari. Deep reds and blacks, pulsing in waves like a bruise forming in real time across his entire body. "Hunger," he said. "Old hunger. Smart hunger." From the cave network, a sound. Low. Not a roar and not a growl. Meg felt it in her teeth before she heard it with her ears. It was the sound of something very large and very patient, announcing that it knew they were here, and had always known, and had been waiting for the dark, because the dark was when it worked. Soren pulled up the Coalition Species Registry on his tactical display. Searched for subsurface predators matching the claw dimensions Meg had photographed. The search returned one result, and when he read it, the color left his face in a way that Meg didn't think Torvan faces could do. Vraxith. The Coalition didn't classify Vraxith as fauna. They classified them as a natural disaster. Solitary apex predators. Hyper-adaptive neurology, capable of learning tool use, disabling technology, and modifying hunting behavior based on observed prey responses. The previous survey team hadn't experienced equipment failure. The file had a survival statistic. Meg read it over Soren's shoulder. She'd seen worse odds in fire. She'd walked into burning canyons where the math said nobody was walking out, and walked out anyway. But fire didn't learn. Fire didn't watch you and get smarter. The Vraxith emerged from the cave mouth. It was enormous. The word didn't help, but language wasn't built for this. Language was built for things that fit inside the normal range of experience. And this was so far outside that range, it bent the frame. Armored plating covered its body in overlapping segments that looked like they'd been forged rather than grown. Its head was broad and low, and its eyes, 6 of them, arranged in an asymmetric pattern that suggested each one tracked a different field of information, caught the faint starlight, and held it like something it was deciding whether to keep. It moved the way real predators move. Not fast, not slow. Correct. Every motion exactly the size it needed to be, and no larger. It was the quietest thing Meg had ever seen, that was also the biggest. It looked at the fire team. Then it looked at the space between them and the drop pod 2 kilometers south. It looked at this space the way a wolf looks at a fence, calculating effort versus reward. Meg picked up a rock. Fist-sized, dense. She threw it, not at the Vraxith, to the left, hard. The rock cracked against the basalt 30 meters away. The creature's head snapped toward the sound, tracked the trajectory, calculated the origin point. Its head turned back to Meg. Its body hadn't moved. That was the information she needed. It prioritizes movement prediction over threat response, she whispered to Luca. Her voice was flat, even, the voice of someone reading data off a screen. It's not reacting to the rock. It's modeling why I threw it. The Vraxith settled its full attention on Meg. All 6 eyes, focused, patient, interested. It had never seen anything like her before. Soren called a defensive formation. Standard Torvan doctrine. Hold ground, tighten the perimeter, create overlapping fields of fire, and wait for the predator to commit to an attack vector. It was the correct response, according to every tactical manual ever written by a species that had been the biggest thing on its home planet for 60 million years. It was the wrong call. The Vraxith didn't commit. It circled, slow and wide, staying at the exact edge of their weapon range, like it had measured it, which it probably had. It watched them dig in, and it watched the way they watched it, and it processed both of these things with a patience that felt less like an animal hunting and more like a surgeon marking incision lines. Meg knew this pattern, not from xenobiology manuals, or combat training, or anything the Coalition had ever taught anyone. She knew it from fire. A wildfire doesn't charge a ridgeline. It sends runners, thin fingers of flame that feel for gaps in the terrain, for draws where the air funnels, for dry spots where the brush hasn't been touched by moisture in weeks. It tests the landscape. It finds the seam. Then it goes through the seams so fast that everything on the other side is dead before it knows the fire has arrived. The Vraxith was probing. She didn't contradict Soren. She positioned herself at the edge of the formation where the light from their camp equipment faded into the dark, and she began doing something that nobody understood, and nobody stopped her from doing, because nobody was sure enough of their own plan to question hers. She was building a map. In the dust at her feet, with the toe of her boot and the faint glow of her wrist display, she charted the Vraxith's movement. Not where it was going. She tracked its pauses, its direction changes, the moments when its head turned, and toward what. She cross-referenced wind direction, ground slope, shadow density. Every time the creature shifted, she adjusted a line in the dust. Luca crouched beside her. "What are you doing?" "Reading." "Reading what?" "Her." "How do you know it's a her?" Meg didn't answer. She added another line. The first real attack came at hour 4. The Vraxith feinted toward Nyx's position, a fast lateral movement that drew Soren's fire like a reflex. Energy bolts lit up the dark. The Vraxith was already gone. It had never been going for Nyx. The feint pulled the team's orientation 30 degrees east, and in the half-second gap, the creature came from the west and hit hard. Luca went down, not from a direct strike. The Vraxith's tail swept low across the ground and caught him at the shins, and he was airborne before his brain caught up with his legs. His shoulder hit rock at the wrong angle, and the sound it made was the kind of sound that travels through other people's bodies in sympathy. Nyx fired. 3 bursts. The Vraxith absorbed 2 and dodged the third, and in dodging the third, it noted Nyx's firing rhythm. The interval between shots, the reset time, the arc of her aim. It was cataloging her. Meg saw this. She saw the creature take information from the engagement the way she took information from fire behavior, as data points in a model that was building itself in real time. "It's getting smarter," she said. Not to anyone. To the dust map at her feet. Soren's second plan was a flanking pattern, textbook. The Vraxith countered it in 40 seconds. His third plan was a fighting retreat toward the drop pod. The Vraxith cut off the retreat path before they'd moved 100 meters, appearing in front of them from a direction that shouldn't have been possible, given its last known position, which meant it had mapped their escape route before they had. 3 plans, 3 failures. The manual was running out of pages, and the thing in the dark was writing its own. Soren stood in the center of their dwindling perimeter, and Meg watched the moment happen on his face. Not panic. Torvald didn't do panic the way humans did. It was more like a machine hitting a wall, a process that had always worked in countering a problem it wasn't built to solve. His hands were steady. His voice was steady. Everything about him was steady, except the thing behind his eyes that was searching for a protocol that didn't exist. He looked at Meg. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The look said it. The look said, "I have done everything I know how to do, and it was not enough, and I am looking at you because you are the only one who hasn't been wrong tonight." Meg didn't take command. She didn't stand up or raise her voice or do anything that looked like authority. She was still crouched over her dust map, and when she spoke, her voice was the same flat, dry tone it always was, the tone of a woman who'd learned somewhere that volume was a luxury, and precision was the only currency that's spent. Rotate Nyx to the southern arc, offset by 15 degrees from her last position. Have her fire once, then hold. Soren looked at her. 2 heartbeats. Then he gave the order. Nyx rotated, fired once, held. The Vraxith adjusted its approach, based on Nyx's old position. It came from the angle it had calculated. The angle was wrong now, by 15 degrees. Enough to put it in Soren's direct line of fire for the first time all night. He didn't waste it. The shot hit. Not lethal. Nothing they had was lethal to this thing, but it was the first clean contact of the night, and the Vraxith pulled back 40 meters to reassess. It had taken damage, minor, but its model had failed for the first time. Again, Meg said. Move Talven to the east berm. Have him broadcast a psychic pulse on a 3-second cycle. Not a message, just noise. Soren gave the order faster this time. Talven, pale and shaking, opened his psychic channels for the first time in months, and pushed outward. The pulse was crude, ugly. It was the psychic equivalent of a flashbang, no information, just static, that scrambled the Vraxith's sensory field for half a second every 3 seconds. The creature paused, recalculated. Its movements became less fluid, less certain. Meg made 4 suggestions. Soren translated all 4 into orders without hesitation. The gap between her words and his commands shrank each time, until by the 4th one, it was seamless. She murmured, and he moved, and the team moved with him. And nobody named what had happened, because naming it would require acknowledging that the chain of command had been rewritten by a woman, drawing lines in the dust. Luca sat against a rock with his shoulder braced and his medkit open, and he watched them work. 2 heads on one animal, he thought. She thinks, he roars. The thing in the dark doesn't know which one to model. The Vraxith pulled back further, reassessed longer. Its 6 eyes tracked Meg with a new quality of attention. Not predatory, not calculating, something between recognition and confusion. It had modeled every member of the fire team and found their limits. Meg didn't have limits it could find. She changed every time it changed. She was a mirror that moved before it did. She looked at the Vraxith, 200 meters out, watching her from the dark, with 6 eyes that caught the starlight like coins at the bottom of a well. I'm going to walk toward it, she said. The silence that followed was the loudest thing on the moon. Alone, she added, not because it needed saying, because she wanted them to hear it and understand that she'd considered the alternative and chosen this. Soren opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Why? Because it can't be outrun and it can't be outfought, and every time we engage it, it gets better. The only thing we haven't tried is not being what it expects. She looked at Luca. His face was white, and his shoulder was wrong, and his eyes were wide. I've walked toward worse, she said, quiet, almost to herself, and it didn't have the decency to think. Something in her voice closed the door on the question before it could form. Meg picked up the rock she'd thrown earlier, the same one. She held it in her right hand. Not a weapon, not a shield, a punctuation mark for a sentence she hadn't written yet. She walked into the open ground. The Vraxith watched her come. Its body was still. Its eyes were not. 200 meters, 150, 100, 80, 60. At 40 meters the creature's muscles tensed, a coiling in its haunches that said every instinct it had was telling it to strike, and something else, something that wasn't instinct, was telling it to wait. Meg sat down, cross-legged, in the dust, 40 meters from the most dangerous living thing the Coalition had ever classified. She placed the rock in front of her. The Vraxith tilted its head, a small movement, tiny, on a body that size. A gesture so unexpected and so strangely delicate that back at the perimeter, Nyx made a sound that was almost a laugh, and then pressed all 4 hands over her mouth, because nothing about this was funny, except the part where everything about it was. Meg didn't move. The Vraxith didn't move. The night held its breath, and the stars watched, and the dust settled around them both, like the universe was making room. 47 minutes. Meg sat in the dust, 40 meters from the Vraxith, for 47 minutes. And the fire team watched from cover, and nobody breathed properly the entire time. Soren had his weapon trained on the creature's center mass. His arms didn't shake. Torvon arms don't shake. But his jaw was clenched so tight that the muscles in his neck had turned to cable, and his eyes had the fixed quality of someone who had decided that if this went wrong, he would empty every charge in his weapon into that thing, and it wouldn't be enough, and he would do it anyway. Luca sat with his back against a rock, and his medkit open on the ground beside him. He'd laid out the trauma supplies in the order he'd need them: coagulant, bone set, pressure wraps, neural stabilizers. His hands arranged them with the automatic precision of a man who had done this in ambulances and emergency rooms and parking lots in Detroit at 2 in the morning. But his eyes never left Meg. Nyx had 3 demolition charges primed and positioned in a triangle around the open ground. She could detonate any of them in under a second. All 4 of her hands were still for the first time since Meg had met her. Still and ready. She'd done the math on the blast radius, and the math said the charges would hurt the Vraxith, and also hurt Meg, and Nyx had decided that this was an acceptable equation, and hated herself for deciding it. Tal then knelt at the perimeter's edge, with his palms flat on the ground, and his eyes closed, and his entire body trembling. He'd opened his psychic channels wide, wider than he'd opened them in over a year, and he was receiving the Vraxith's emotional output like a radio tuned to a frequency that burned. He whispered to the team, running translation. His voice came in fragments, each one pulled from him like a tooth. Curious. It's testing models, running patterns. She doesn't fit its patterns. 30 seconds of silence. Frustrated. Not angry. Frustrated like a lock that won't open. She's a lock it can't pick. A minute. Curious again. Different kind. Deeper. Meg sat. The Vraxith sat. Between them, the rock. She didn't try to tame it. That would have been a story about dominance, and this wasn't that story. She didn't try to communicate with it, not in any way that the word communicate normally means. No gestures, no sounds, no offerings. What she did was something that didn't have a name in any coalition manual, because no one had ever done it before, and no one had ever needed to, because no one had ever been stupid enough or brilliant enough to try. She predicted it. Every time the creature shifted its weight, a lean forward, a tilt of the head, a redistribution of mass from one set of limbs to another, Meg adjusted her position, not away, not toward. She moved to the place that told the Vraxith she knew where it would strike before it struck. She wasn't faster. She wasn't stronger. She wasn't armored or venomous or psychic. She was predictive. She read the creature the way she read fire, as a system of pressures and tendencies that express themselves through movement before they express themselves through action. The Vraxith had never encountered this. It was the apex predator on every world it had ever hunted. It had faced species with thicker armor, heavier weapons, faster reflexes, sharper senses. It had killed all of them by learning their patterns faster than they could learn its. That was its gift, its evolutionary masterpiece. It was the thing that modeled other things. And here was something that modeled it back. The creature tried 3 more test movements. Each time Meg adjusted. Each time the adjustment was correct. Each time the Vraxith processed the information and found the same answer. She knows. At minute 39, Tal then made a sound that was halfway between a gasp and a sob. His skin exploded in colors, deep gold and white, and a shade of blue that Luca had never seen on any living thing. "What?" Soren said. Tal Ven's hands were shaking on the ground. It changed. The classification. The way it thinks about her. It shifted. Shifted to what? His species had 1,000 words for the textures of thought and feeling, and none of them were right, and the closest one he could find in Coalition Standard was so inadequate it hurt to use it. Same, he said. It thinks she's the same. Soren didn't understand. Luca did. He understood it the way you understand something in your body before your brain catches up. A recognition that hits the chest before it reaches the head. The Vraxith had reclassified Meg. Not prey, not threat, not rival. Peer. A fellow predator. Something that hunted by knowing, just as it did. Something that survived not through force, but through the relentless, tireless, obsessive work of reading the world faster than the world could change. The creature did something none of them expected. It stood up. All the way up. Full height. It was taller standing than it had been crouching, and the difference was enough to make Nyx's hands twitch toward the detonators. 12 feet of armored apex biology, unfolding like a building deciding to be taller. It looked at Meg. She looked at it. Then it turned and walked back into the cave. Not running, not retreating, walking. The walk of something that had satisfied its curiosity and made its judgment, and had no further business here tonight. The dust settled. Meg sat alone in the open ground for another full minute before she stood up. When she walked back to the perimeter, her legs were shaking, and she didn't try to hide it, because hiding it would have been a lie, and she just spent 47 minutes telling the truth. They reached the drop pod. Extraction proceeded. Nobody spoke on the flight up. On Careth Prime, Soren filed his after-action report. He wrote it in the plain, factual language the Coalition required, and he credited Meg Calder with the survival of the entire fire team. And when he submitted it, the report was flagged within an hour. Not because it was unusual, because it was impossible. Vraxith encounters carried a 94% fatality rate. The remaining 6% were survivors who had escaped by reaching extraction before the creature finished learning their patterns. A zero-casualty outcome had never been recorded. In the entire history of the Coalition's contact with the species, hundreds of encounters across dozens of worlds, no one had ever stood in front of a Vraxith and walked away with every member of their team alive. The intake hall didn't laugh this time. It didn't cheer either. There was no slow clap, no grudging nod of respect, no dramatic reversal of fortune. What happened was quieter, and in some ways harder to carry. The alien recruits watched Meg walk through the concourse, and they watched her the way you watch something you can't fit into the categories you already have. Not admiration, not fear, a recalibration. The quiet, grinding work of a worldview adjusting itself around a new fact that doesn't fit anywhere comfortable. Coalition Command offered Meg a transfer to a higher-rated fire team, 3rd Fang, better quarters, better equipment, a squad leader with a clean record and commendations on the wall. She said no. She said it the way she said most things, flat, dry, final, like the word had been sitting in her mouth ready to go before the question finished. She stayed with 9th Fang. Soren trained harder after Varek 4, not out of shame and not out of competition. He trained because Meg had shown him something about the distance between following a manual and reading a situation, and he wanted to close that distance. He started asking questions during briefings, not procedural questions, real ones. What if the manual's wrong? What if the terrain doesn't match the model? Luca stopped making himself small. The geometry of invisibility that he'd spent 3 months perfecting, the careful angles, the measured volume, the preemptive laughs, he set it down. Not all at once, piece by piece, like someone unpacking a bag they'd been carrying so long they'd forgotten it had weight. Nyx started finishing her sentences. Talven opened his psychic sensitivity during a routine team meal and felt the emotional temperature of the table, and said out loud that Luca's soup made him feel a color that humans didn't have a word for, but that was close to the feeling of a window being opened in a room that had been closed for a long time. Nobody knew what to do with that. Luca gave him a second bowl. The Xenobiology Division requested the HerHFY mission data. They analyzed the Vraxith's behavioral recordings. They found something in the final frames. After the creature withdrew, the recording showed the rock Meg had placed, still sitting in the dust. Beside it, the Vraxith had placed the second rock. The xenobiologists didn't publish this immediately. They ran the image through 12 different analysis protocols and convened a review board and spent 2 weeks arguing about whether it constituted communication or coincidence. They asked Meg what she thought it meant. She smiled, the kind of smile that people give when they already know the answer to something and have decided that knowing it is enough, and explaining it would only make it smaller. 3 weeks later, a report came in from deep space. A colony ship had gone silent in the Dramara corridor, a region flagged for Vraxith migration activity. 1,200 civilians, no communications, no power readings. The long-range scans showed movement signatures on the hull. Possibly 4. Fireteam 9th Fang was not on the recommended response list. They were selected anyway. The order carried a handwritten note from the Coalition's senior tactical commander, a Torvan general named Vos Harath, who had served for 40 years and never handwritten anything in his career. His aide had to find him a pen. He hadn't held one in a decade. The note was 2 words. Send her. The colony ship Gentle Passage sat dead in the Dramara corridor, like a cathedral someone had turned off. No running lights, no engine glow, no communication signal pulsing its little heartbeat into the void. Just a long, dark shape drifting against a field of stars. And on its hull, visible from the approach shuttle at a distance that should have been too far to see, claw marks, hundreds of them, scratched into the metal from multiple directions in patterns that looked less like damage and more like handwriting in a language nobody wanted to learn. 1,200 civilians inside, families, children, researchers, a colony-founding crew that had been 3 weeks from their destination when the lights went out and something got in. Fireteam 9th Fang docked at the ship's emergency airlock. The seal hissed, and the inner door opened, and the dark inside was the specific kind of dark that has weight, the kind you walk into and feel pressing against your skin like water. Meg went first. Not because protocol demanded it. Soren was squad leader. Soren should have gone first. But Soren stepped aside, and Meg stepped forward, and the transition happened in the space between 2 footfalls, and nobody commented on it, because commenting would have required pretending it was new. The ship's corridors were wrong, not damaged the way a storm damages a building, randomly, violently, without thought. The Vraxith had reshaped the interior with surgical intent. Lighting conduits severed at specific junctions to create pockets of total darkness. Bulkheads jammed at angles that funneled movement into narrow channels. Ventilation ducts torn open in patterns that redirected airflow and carried scent in controlled directions. They weren't hunting. The colonists had been driven inward, compressed from the outer sections toward the ship's core, sealed behind whatever barriers they'd managed to close before the corridors became someone else's architecture. 3 confirmed, Nix said. Her scanner showed thermal signatures moving through the lower decks in coordinated sweeps. 4th signal is different. Bigger. Stationary. Deep in the cargo hold. Tal Ven had his channels open. Wide open. He'd made this choice before they docked. No lockdown, no walls, no hiding. He stood in the corridor with his skin cycling through colors like weather, and he felt the Vraxith the way his species was built to feel things, as shapes of intention moving through the psychic dark. They're talking to each other, he said. His voice was thin, strained, like a wire asked to carry more current than it was rated for. The 3 hunters, they're coordinating. And the 4th one, the big one, she's directing them. Soren's face did the thing it did when facts contradicted doctrine. The coalition's files were clear. HFY were solitary. They didn't cooperate. They didn't communicate. They didn't form groups or hierarchies, or anything that resembled social structure. The files were wrong. Meg studied the corridor map on her wrist display. She traced the damage patterns, the herding routes, the positions of the 3 hunters, the stationary signal in the cargo hold. "She's not hunting," Meg said. "The big one, she's nesting." She said it with the certainty of someone who had seen this pattern before, not in an alien predator on a colony ship, but in the behavior of desperate things protecting a space because they had no other space left. The 3 are her children, young adults. They're herding the colonists because she told them to, not for food. She's securing the ship because she can't survive in open space anymore. "How do you know that?" Soren asked. "Because if they wanted the colonists dead, the colonists would be dead." That sat in the corridor like a dropped stone, heavy, settling. Meg did the math. She did it the way she always did, not on paper, not on a display, but in the space behind her eyes, where patterns lived and talked to each other in a language she'd never been able to explain to anyone. 5 Ninth Fang members. 3 active HFY hunters in enclosed corridors with adapted terrain advantage. 1 matriarch in a fixed position. 1,200 civilians in a compressed core. No air support, no reinforcements. The ship's hull couldn't take external fire without killing everyone inside. There was no military solution. She told Soren the plan. His face went through several stages of objection and arrived at acceptance the way a river arrives at the sea, not because it chose to, but because every other direction was a wall. "Hold the colonists' position," Meg said. "Don't engage the 3 hunters. Occupy them. Make them think about you without making them need to kill you. Nix. Rig the corridors between here and the cargo hold with sensory disruption charges. Not lethal, confusing. Scramble their spatial processing." Nix nodded. All 4 hands were already working. "Talven, I need you to do something hard." He looked at her. His skin was a storm. "Push outward. Find the matriarch's psychic frequency, the command signal she uses with the young ones. Copy it. Broadcast a single word on that frequency toward the 3 hunters." "What word?" "Wait." Talven closed his eyes. His whole body shuddered. Then he reached. Not with his hands, not with his voice, with the part of himself he'd kept locked away for over a year. Because the last time he'd opened it fully, something had happened that he never talked about, and that lived in the gray flatness of his skin, like a scar lives in tissue. He reached and he found the frequency, and it hurt, and he used it anyway. Meg turned to Luca. "Stay at the last bulkhead before the cargo hold." "No." The word came out fast and hard, and it was the first time Luca Bren had said no to anything since he'd arrived on Carith Prime. "Luca, I stay at the bulkhead, fine, but you're taking the med kit." He held it out. Not like an offering, like a fact. Meg took it. She walked alone through 500 meters of dark corridor that the HFY had reshaped into something between a labyrinth and a throat. Nix's disruption charges fired in sequence behind her, muffled thumps that sent ripples of interference through the ship's acoustics. Somewhere on the lower decks, the 3 young HFY paused in their patrol. Talven's broadcast hit them like a hand on the shoulder. "Wait." The command came in their mother's voice. They waited. The cargo hold was massive, a cathedral space meant for the supplies and equipment of a new colony. Most of the cargo had been pushed to the walls, shoved aside with enormous force to clear a central area. The floor was scored with claw marks. The air was warm and dense, and smelled like ozone and something organic and old. The matriarch was in the center. She was the largest living thing Meg had ever seen that wasn't geology. Her armored plates were scarred and pitted, worn by decades of hunting across worlds that didn't exist on any map Meg had read. Her 6 eyes were dimmer than her children's, clouded at the edges, slower to focus. Her body was immense and still, and carried the particular heaviness of something that had been powerful for a very long time, and was learning what it felt like when that power began its long walk toward the door. Her left forelimb was wrong, twisted at an angle that spoke of an old injury, a break that had healed badly, probably years ago, probably on a world where there was nothing to set it and no one to help. The limb functioned, but it didn't function well, and in the mathematics of apex predation, not well is the same as not enough. That was why she was here. Not conquest, not hunger. She couldn't hunt in open space anymore. Her children could, but she couldn't, and she had brought them here, to this ship, to these corridors, to this enclosed and manageable world, because it was the only territory she could still hold. Meg set down the medkit, opened it, took out the trauma supplies. The matriarch watched her, 6 clouded eyes tracking every movement with the particular intensity of something that has spent its entire life being the most dangerous thing in every room, and has just realized it might not be in this one. Meg walked forward, slowly, not with her hands up, not in submission. She walked the way she'd walked into the open ground on Varek 4, with the measured calm of someone who has made a decision that sits below the level where fear operates. She knelt beside the injured forelimb. The matriarch's muscles coiled. A tremor ran through her body, the cold spring tension of a predator in proximity to something touching it. Meg didn't flinch. She put her hands on the limb. The armored plates were warm, warmer than the air, warmer than anything on this dead ship had a right to be. She cleaned the wound. Old scar tissue, infected in 2 places, where the plate edges had cracked and exposed the tissue beneath. She applied the coagulant where it bled, the bone-set compound where the joint had calcified wrong. She worked with the focused, unhurried hands of someone who had done field medicine on injuries worse than this, and in conditions worse than this, and hadn't flinched then either. It took 2 hours. Neither of them made a sound. When it was done, Meg sat back. She reached into her jacket pocket and took out a rock. Small, dense, basalt. She'd carried it from Varek 4. She'd carried it the way some people carry photographs. Not to look at, but to hold. To know it was there. She placed it on the cargo hold floor. The matriarch looked at it. A long time. Longer than 2 hours of wound care. Longer than the 47 minutes on Varek 4. She looked at this small rock, placed on the floor by this small creature, that had walked alone into her den, and touched her where she was broken, and asked for nothing in return. The matriarch raised her head, not toward Meg, toward her children, toward the corridors and the colonists, and the territory she had claimed because she was afraid and didn't know another way. She called them off. The psychic signal was a wave. It rolled through the ship like a tide rolling back from a shore. Tal then, 5 decks away, dropped to his knees. The signal translated through his open channels and filled his body with a color and a meaning that his species had a word for, but that he'd never felt before. It was the word for recognizing something as yourself in a body that is not yours. The closest translation in Coalition Standard was same, but same was a shadow of it, a footprint where the whole animal had been. Not prey, same. The 3 young Vraxith withdrew. They left the corridors. They left the colonists. They moved through the ship like water draining, and they gathered in the cargo hold around their mother, and they waited for her to tell them what came next. The matriarch stood, slowly. Her repaired forelimb took her weight in a way it hadn't taken weight in years. She walked toward the hull breach they'd entered through, the hole they'd torn in the side of the gentle passage, and she paused at the threshold of open space. She looked back at Meg. Meg looked at her. Something passed between them that Tal then couldn't translate, and didn't try. The Vraxith left. 1,200 colonists, 0 casualties. The Gentle Passage limped into the nearest coalition port under emergency power, restored by Nix in 16 minutes, using tools and profanity in equal measure. Fireteam 9th Fang returned to Kareth Prime. Coalition Command classified the Dramara Corridor incident at the highest level, and then immediately created a new department that hadn't existed before, Apex Behavioral Interface, the study of non-combat resolution protocols for encounters with apex predator species. A department built around one idea that one human had proven twice, that the most dangerous things in the galaxy might not need to be fought. They might need to be understood. They offered Meg the directorship. She declined. She asked for one thing: keep 9th Fang together. The barracks hadn't changed. Same 2 firm bunks, same 2 wide frames, same flickering light in the hallway outside. The cleaning drone was still broken against the wall, though someone, probably Luca, had put a small potted plant on top of it, which was either an act of optimism or vandalism, depending on how you looked at it. Meg sat on her bunk, cleaning gear, piece by piece, the same way she did everything, thoroughly, quietly, without wasted motion. Soren sat across from her, reviewing tactical overlays on his display. He'd started annotating them with his own notes, deviations from doctrine, alternate approaches, questions for the next briefing. His notes were getting longer, his questions were getting better. Luca was restocking the medkits, 2 of everything now. He'd put in the requisition himself without being asked, and when the supply officer questioned why a fireteam of 5 needed medical supplies rated for a squad of 20, Luca had said, "Because we go places where you need it," and the supply officer had looked at his unit patch and said nothing further. Nix was building something at the workbench. It had 4 moving parts and an energy cell, and it was either a repair tool or an explosive device, and with Nix, the difference was largely theoretical. Talven sat by the viewport, eyes open, skin shifting in slow, gentle colors, pale blues, soft golds, the occasional ripple of green. He was feeling the station, the hum of 10,000 beings going about their lives, the texture of ordinary days. He felt it the way you feel sunlight after a long time indoors. Not dramatic, just warm. Luca looked up from the medkits. "Why do you carry that rock?" Meg turned it over in her hand. The one from Varric 4. The one the Vraxith had answered. She held it up to the barracks light, and the basalt caught the glow, and for a moment it looked less like a rock and more like something that had been given. "Because someone put one down for me once," she said, "and I didn't know what it meant for a long time." She put the rock back in her pocket. Luca nodded, the nod of someone who doesn't understand yet, but has decided to hold the space where understanding will go when it arrives. Outside the viewport, the stars turned. Somewhere in the deep corridors of Coalition Command, a Torvon general put down a pen he still wasn't comfortable holding, and looked at a report about a human woman who weighed 130 pounds and had done the thing that none of them could do, and had done it by sitting down. He didn't understand either. But the galaxy was wider than it had been yesterday, and the things that lived in it were stranger and more capable of grace than anyone had guessed. And somewhere in the dark between the stars, an old hunter walked with her children on a healed limb, and remembered a small creature that had placed a rock on the floor, and asked for nothing. The rock was still in the cargo hold of the Gentle Passage. Beside it, the matriarch had placed the second one.